Imagine standing in ancient Mesopotamia 4,000 years ago, the cradle of civilization, where cities like Babylon and Ur and Nineveh rose from the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Here, long before Wall Street or the IMF, debt was already shaping human destiny. Farmers and merchants scratched their promises into clay tablets. I owe you grain, I owe you silver, I will pay after the harvest. Those small pieces of clay became the first IOUs, the ancestors of every mortgage, every credit card, every government bond that exists today. But the rulers of Mesopotamia understood something our modern governments pretend not to. Debt was dangerous. When too many citizens became trapped in obligations, when farmers could no longer plant because they owed too much grain, when laborers were forced into bondage because they couldn't pay, society itself began to break down. Rebellions flared, armies weakened, families collapsed. A state strangled by debt could not endure. And so, in a twist that feels almost unthinkable today, kings would sometimes wipe the slate clean. They declared debt jubilees, mass cancellations of obligations. The tablets were broken, the debts were forgiven, slaves were freed. The society rebooted. To us, raised in an age where debt is permanent, this sounds radical. But for them, it was survival. The rulers knew that if citizens were buried forever under obligations, the entire system would implode. These jubilees weren't acts of charity, they were acts of preservation. A king who forgave debts wasn't giving up power. He was securing it. By resetting the financial system, he bought loyalty, restored productivity, and ensured the continuity of his rule. Debt was a tool, but it was a tool that had to be controlled. The ancients feared its power to enslave. And yet, over centuries, the logic flipped. Instead of fearing debt, elites learned to weaponize it. They discovered that keeping people in permanent obligation was even more profitable than wiping the slate clean. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia are long gone, but the mechanism they recorded, the transformation of promises into chains, still defines our world. Fast forward nearly 3,000 years from Mesopotamia. The world has changed, empires have risen and fallen, but one truth remains: debt is still at the heart of power. Only now, in Renaissance Italy, it is no longer kings declaring jubilees. It is bankers discovering that control of credit means control of entire nations. Florence in the 15th century was not just a city of art and architecture. It was the financial engine of Europe. Behind the dazzling frescoes and marble cathedrals was something even more influential: the ledger books of families like the Medici. These weren't kings, generals, or priests. They were merchants who understood a simple but revolutionary fact. Lending money could be more powerful than wielding an army. The Catholic Church officially banned usury, the charging of excessive interest, but clever bankers found ways around it. They disguised loans as trade deals, used double-entry bookkeeping to obscure profits, and created complex instruments that made interest look like fees or currency exchanges. The Medici mastered this game. They lent to popes, kings, and dukes. They financed wars, marriages, and coronations. And with every loan, their influence grew. Soon, rulers who once seemed untouchable found themselves dependent on Florentine bankers. A king who borrowed to fund a war could not defy the hand that held his purse. A pope who needed credit to build St. Peter's Basilica had to tolerate bankers meddling in church politics. Debt was no longer just an economic arrangement. It had become a form of political leverage. The Medici rose from merchants to monarch makers, their wealth woven into every corner of Europe's power structure. They didn't just finance history, they wrote it. Artists like Michelangelo and Botticelli painted masterpieces with Medici patronage. Cathedrals and palaces were built with borrowed money. Wars were won or lost, not on the battlefield, but in the counting houses of Florence. But for the ordinary Florentine, debt looked different. Guilds and craftsmen often fell into obligations they couldn't escape, while the city's elite consolidated more wealth and more power. The same mechanism that enslaved Mesopotamian farmers now quietly bound entire nations. And unlike the kings of Babylon, the Medici never declared jubilees. Why would they? Permanent obligation was more profitable. The Medici story reveals the turning point. Debt was no longer feared as a force that could unravel society. It was embraced as a weapon to shape it. From this moment onward, debt ceased to be a danger for rulers. It became their greatest ally. And in the hands of financiers, it became the invisible empire that rivaled every throne and every crown. 17th century Europe was a powder keg of wars, revolutions, and shifting empires. Kings fought for territory, merchants battled for trade routes, and nations stretched themselves thin across oceans. But one small republic, the Dutch Republic, stumbled upon a financial invention that would change the course of global history. They discovered how to transform debt into the very foundation of state power. Until this point, wars were limited by a simple reality. A king could only fight as long as the gold and silver in his treasury lasted. When the coffers ran dry, the swords went back into their scabbards. The Dutch shattered that limitation. Instead of waiting for taxes to trickle in, they sold bonds, promises of repayment with interest. directly to their own citizens. Suddenly, war could be financed not by treasure, but by trust. The Dutch bond market was revolutionary. These pieces of parchment, traded in Amsterdam's coffee houses and merchant exchanges, created a new kind of wealth. For investors, lending to the government was safe, almost guaranteed, because repayment was backed by taxes on trade, salt, and shipping, the lifeblood of the Republic. For the government, bonds meant armies could march and ships could sail indefinitely. War was no longer constrained by resources. It was fueled by promises. This system spread quickly. England copied it in 1694 with the creation of the Bank of England. For the first time in history, national debt became permanent. Governments didn't borrow only in times of crisis. They borrowed as a way of life, rolling debts over endlessly, using new loans to pay the interest on the old. A system born of necessity became the central engine of empire. The consequences were staggering. Wars that once would have bankrupted kings could now last decades. Empires expanded across oceans, not because their rulers were richer in gold, but because they had tapped into an endless well of credit. The creditors, of course, were the true winners. Wealthy merchants, bankers, and investors earned steady interest, while ordinary citizens carried the burden in the form of higher taxes and rising costs. But there was a darker side. When faith in the bond market cracked, panic spread like wildfire. Investors who had lent eagerly to governments suddenly sold their bonds in fear, collapsing trust overnight. In Amsterdam, London, and Paris, financial panics became as dangerous to nations as foreign armies. Power no longer rested only in kings or generals. It rested in the bondholders, the anonymous crowd of creditors who could decide whether a state lived or died by simply lending or withholding their gold. This was the birth of the modern financial system. National debt as a permanent product, traded, resold, and expanded endlessly. The state was no longer funded by its treasury. It was mortgaged to its creditors. And for the first time, ordinary people learned that their taxes, their labor, their very futures were collateral for wars they never chose. Debt had graduated from a private promise, scratched on clay, to a public institution carved into law. It was no longer an emergency measure. It was the bloodstream of empire. And once nations tasted its power, they never let it go. By the late 20th century, debt was no longer just the engine of European empires. It had become the lifeblood of the global financial system. And nowhere was its power more devastatingly clear than in Latin America during the 1980s, a period still remembered as La Década Perdida, the lost decade. In the 1970s, oil prices soared. OPEC nations deposited billions of petrodollars into Western banks, and those banks faced a dilemma: what to do with so much idle capital. The solution was as simple as it was catastrophic. Lend it out. Not to ordinary citizens, but to governments across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and dozens of others borrowed heavily, encouraged by Western lenders eager to recycle their surplus dollars. Credit seemed limitless, and leaders assured their citizens that growth would follow. But debt is never free. Much of this money was not invested in productive infrastructure or industry. It was spent on prestige projects, political patronage, or simply wasted through corruption. Economies became dependent on constant borrowing, rolling over loans year after year. And when the global winds shifted, the traps snapped shut. In 1979, U.S. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to combat American inflation. Almost overnight, borrowing costs skyrocketed. Mexico, which had borrowed in dollars, suddenly faced interest payments it could no longer afford. In August 1982, Mexico announced it could not meet its obligations. Panic spread across the financial world. If Mexico could default, so could Brazil, Argentina, and dozens of others. The crisis threatened to unravel the global banking system itself. The solution? More loans, but this time under far harsher terms. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank stepped in, offering rescue packages tied to structural adjustment programs. On paper, these programs were meant to stabilize economies. In reality, they were recipes for austerity. Governments were forced to slash spending, privatize state industries, cut social services, and liberalize trade. The citizens who had never touched the loans were the ones who paid for them. The human cost was staggering. In country after country, unemployment soared. Inflation devoured wages. Health and education budgets were gutted. Ordinary families watched their living standards collapse while their governments sent billions abroad in interest payments. A farmer in Brazil or a teacher in Mexico might never have seen a single dollar of the borrowed billions, yet they paid the price for decades. Meanwhile, Western banks emerged intact. They had made risky loans, collected interest, and when the defaults came, the IMF ensured they were repaid anyway. The cycle was perfect. Profits privatized, losses socialized, nations shackled to obligations they could not escape. This was debt as discipline. Nations learned that sovereignty could be compromised not by invasion, but by contract. The creditors didn't need armies. They had balance sheets. And when a country faltered, they rewrote its policies, dictated its budget, and reshaped its society, all in the name of repayment. The lost decade was not just a Latin American tragedy. It was a warning to the world. In the age of global finance, debt could conquer nations as effectively as any empire. But unlike the empires of the past, this conquest left no monuments, only ledgers filled with obligations that would echo for generations. For most of history, debt was something kings, merchants, or governments worried about. But in the 20th century, the system shifted. Debt stopped being the tool of only nations and elites. It became a product sold directly to individuals, marketed not as obligation, but as freedom. The transformation began with the mortgage. In the early 20th century, homeownership was still the privilege of the wealthy. But after World War II, banks and governments discovered a new formula: lend to the middle class, offer 30-year mortgages backed by government guarantees, and suddenly millions of families could buy homes they otherwise could never afford. The American dream was born, but so was the perfect revenue stream for lenders. A $100,000 house became a $300,000 lifetime obligation. Interest turned aspiration into a gold mine. Then came the credit card. In the 1950s and the 60s, plastic rectangles arrived with glossy marketing campaigns. Take it now, pay later. What had once been shameful, living beyond your means, was rebranded as convenience and empowerment. But hidden in the fine print was the trap: double-digit interest rates, compounded monthly. Millions of people began rolling balances forward, paying far more in interest than they had ever spent on goods. Debt was no longer an emergency bridge, it was a lifestyle. By the late 20th century, another innovation locked in an entire generation: student loans. Education had once been a path to opportunity, but rising tuition and easy credit turned it into another debt machine. Young people were told that borrowing tens of thousands of dollars was an investment in their future. And for many, it became a lifetime anchor. Graduates entered adulthood already chained, paying for decades before they even owned a home or started a family. And the genius of these systems was that they normalized debt. Borrowing was no longer a last resort. It was the default condition of life. You borrow for a house, you borrow for a car, you borrow for an education. You borrow with a swipe of a card for dinner, coffee, or groceries. Entire economies came to depend on constant consumer borrowing. Without it, growth would stall. With it, banks collected steady streams of interest, month after month, generation after generation. The result is a society where debt is invisible because it is everywhere. Families plan their lives around mortgage payments. Students choose careers based on loan obligations. Entire industries are built on refinancing, collections, and interest extraction. Banks don't just want debts repaid. They want them rolled over, refinanced, extended. The longer you owe, the more profitable you become. This is the final evolution of debt, not as emergency measure, not as imperial tool, but as the product itself. You are not the customer, you are the product. Your future income, your labor, your choices, all transformed into predictable streams of payments that flow upward. And the cruelest trick is that this has been sold to you as freedom. Freedom to own a home, freedom to study, freedom to consume. But freedom purchased on credit is not freedom. It is dependency, polished and packaged as prosperity. From clay tablets in Mesopotamia to mortgages in suburbia, from the Medici's ledgers to the IMF's contracts, from Dutch bond markets to student loan portals, the story is always the same. Debt enriches the creditor, it burdens the debtor, and it concentrates power in the hands of those who issue promises and collect repayments. The most profitable product in history doesn't come from mines or factories. It comes from the future, yours. Every payment you make is a reminder that debt has been deliberately engineered, not to set you free, but to keep you tethered. History doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme, and the rhyme of debt is louder than ever. Nations collapse under it. Families live entire lives within it. And elites build empires on it. The only question is whether you recognize the pattern in time. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe, because history has the answers, and I'll show you where to look.